It was a picture-perfect evening in a quiet suburban neighborhood where every house seemed to blend into the other, each one neatly landscaped with trimmed lawns and white picket fences. In the Miller household, everything appeared just as it should be, serene and idyllic. Jessica Miller, a stay-at-home mum in her early 30s, had always been the embodiment of the perfect mother. Her smile was warm and constant, her energy boundless as she juggled the daily routine of caring for her two children, Jake, who was 5, and Sophie, who was 3. Her husband, Mark, worked long hours at a nearby law firm, providing the comfortable life they had always dreamed of. Jessica and Mark had met in college, and their love story had been straight out of a fairy tale. They had built their life together with ease, and the arrival of their 2 children had only deepened their bond. Jessica devoted herself to their family, always ensuring that her children were happy, healthy, and well-behaved. She was the quintessential mother figure, making crafts, baking cookies, and keeping their home spotless. Mark often marveled at how she seemed to handle everything so effortlessly, never once complaining about the daily demands of raising 2 young kids. He admired her ability to make their life look so easy, and for a long time that's exactly what it seemed to be. A perfect family. However, beneath the surface, things were beginning to shift. No one noticed the subtle changes at first. Jessica's smiles became a little less frequent, and her laugh didn't ring out as brightly as it once had. She grew quieter, her eyes occasionally distant, as if she were lost in thought, even when surrounded by her children. She began to isolate herself from friends and family, declining invitations to gatherings and skipping social events that she once eagerly attended. Her once spotless home started to show signs of wear. Dishes piled up in the sink, the floors that once gleamed now looked streaked with dust. Yet, when anyone came to visit, Jessica would put on a brave face, tidying up quickly and insisting that everything was fine. Mark, though he noticed the changes, brushed them off. He was focused on his career and thought that Jessica's fatigue was simply a result of raising 2 young kids while managing the household on her own. It was a tough job, especially with his long hours at the office, but he believed in his wife's strength. Still, there were times when he came home to find her sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the TV, her shoulders slumped, and her once vibrant energy drained. He tried to comfort her, asking if she needed help, but Jessica would always reassure him, saying it was just a phase. "I'm just tired, Mark," she'd say, flashing him a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The children, too, were growing up quickly. Jake had started school, and Sophie was quickly learning to speak in full sentences, her once tiny voice now filling the house with endless chatter. Jessica's days were spent preparing meals, keeping up with laundry, and running errands. Despite the seemingly perfect life, she couldn't shake the sense of dread that seemed to linger in the corners of her mind. At night, after tucking the children into their beds, she would sit in the darkened living room, feeling a hollow emptiness creeping in. No one knew what had been happening behind closed doors, what turmoil Jessica was hiding from the world. The outside, she still appeared to be the same doting mother and wife, but inside, the cracks were widening. Yet it was in these quiet, unseen moments that the stage was set for a tragedy that no one would ever expect. As the evening unfolded, Jessica Miller continued with the nightly routine she had carried out countless times before. It was just another ordinary night in the Miller household, or so it seemed. The children had finished their dinner, and their energy, as usual, was boundless. Jake ran around the living room, his giggles filling the air, while Sophie followed, closely behind, her tiny feet trying to keep up with her older brother. Jessica watched them, her heart aching with a mixture of love and something else, something darker, buried deep beneath the surface. She tried to smile at them, but the gesture felt strained. As usual, she herded them upstairs for their bath. The house was quiet except for the soft padding of her footsteps and the faint sounds of Jake and Sophie's voices as they talked over one another. Normally, the children loved bath time, the warm water, the bubbles, and the fun toys. But tonight, the air in the bathroom felt different. The familiar scent of lavender soap seemed too strong, almost stifling, and the flickering light from the overhead bulb cast odd shadows across the walls. Jessica felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her as she filled the tub with warm water, carefully testing the temperature to ensure it was just right. She took a deep breath, trying to push away the unsettling thoughts that lingered in her mind. This was supposed to be a routine, something comforting. Yet for reasons she couldn't quite understand, everything felt off. As she gently lowered Sophie into the tub, she noticed her daughter's innocent smile as the warm water splashed around her. Jake, ever the curious one, climbed in beside her, splashing water playfully. For a brief moment, Jessica watched them, a pang of guilt twisting inside her. But then the thoughts came rushing back, ones she had been trying to suppress for months. The loneliness, the exhaustion, the overwhelming feeling of being trapped, drowning in a life that no longer felt like her own. The water in the tub rippled gently as Jessica stood there, staring at her children. The rhythmic sound of water sloshing around them was hypnotic, calming in a way that made it hard to think clearly. She didn't know exactly when the idea had started to form in her mind, but suddenly it was there. Dark, insistent, impossible to ignore. She could end the pain. She could stop feeling the weight of everything that had built up inside her. The thought seemed to take hold of her, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. With a steady hand, Jessica gently held both children, one in each arm, and guided them under the water. They didn't resist. They trusted her. It was over before she even realized it. The silence following their brief struggle in the water hanging in the air like a suffocating blanket. Their small bodies, once so full of life, were now still. The room was eerily quiet, save for the slow drip of water from the faucet. Jessica stared at them, her breath shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. A strange calm washed over her as she drained the tub, watching the water swirl down the drain. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to shake the fog in her mind, but the reality of what had just happened hadn't fully set in. It was almost as if she were floating outside herself, watching her own actions unfold without fully understanding them. She dressed the children in their pajamas as if nothing had happened. She tucked them into their beds, their faces peaceful, their bodies warm. They looked so serene, so perfect, as if they were only sleeping. And for a brief moment, Jessica allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything could go back to normal. She turned off the light, her steps slow as she left their room. When she closed the door behind her, the house was still. The weight in her chest hadn't lifted, but somehow she felt a strange sense of finality, as though she had done something irreversible, something that could never be undone. The night carried on, quiet and unremarkable. To the outside world, Jessica Miller was still a mother, a wife, a woman who had just put her children to bed. But inside, the storm raged on. The silence that followed the unimaginable event was suffocating. Jessica Miller stood still in the hallway for a moment, her body numb. She glanced down at her hands, almost expecting them to tremble, but they didn't. Her pulse, however, was racing, her heart thundering in her chest as if it were trying to escape her rib cage. Yet outwardly there was nothing to give her away. She took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, the cool air filling her lungs as if trying to ground her. The house was eerily still, save for the distant hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Jessica moved with quiet precision as she walked into the kitchen, her mind strangely calm despite the chaos that had just unfolded upstairs. She placed her hands on the countertop and leaned over, staring at the sink as if it held some sort of answer, though she wasn't sure what the question was. It felt as though she had stepped out of her own body, observing everything from a distance, detached. Her thoughts were hazy, disconnected from reality, and yet in this strange state she felt more in control than she had in months. She boiled water for tea, methodically following each step of the process, as if it were a routine she could cling to for some semblance of normalcy. Her hands, still not trembling, moved quickly, but without haste, as if she had all the time in the world. The kettle whistled and she poured the steaming water into a cup, adding a small spoonful of honey. Jessica had always loved tea, the comforting warmth of it always soothing her when the world seemed overwhelming. Tonight, though, it didn't have the same effect. There was something hollow in the way the tea sat in her hands, as if it had lost its ability to comfort her. The minutes ticked by slowly, almost too slowly. Mark wasn't due home for another hour or so. She knew that he would be exhausted after a long day at work, just as he always was. He would come in, kiss her on the cheek, ask how the kids were, and she would tell him they were asleep just like every other night. It was easy. Everything had always been easy except tonight. Tonight everything felt different, darker, like the shadows in the corners of the room had grown larger and more menacing. She sipped her tea, the warmth spreading through her body, but it couldn't erase the cold, gnawing sensation in the pit of her stomach. Jessica knew she couldn't undo what had happened. She couldn't change it. The truth was now lodged deep inside her, pressing against her chest, suffocating her. But she couldn't let it show. She couldn't let anyone see the monster she had become. In the quiet of the house, Jessica began to prepare herself for Mark's arrival. She wiped down the counters, rearranged the throw pillows on the couch, and straightened the magazines on the coffee table. She wanted everything to look perfect. She had to make everything look perfect. After all, nothing had changed. Not yet. She had tucked her children into bed just like any other night. And when Mark walked through the door, he would never know what had transpired in the quiet of the upstairs bathroom. Mark's voice broke through the silence as the door creaked open. He stepped inside, shaking off the chill of the evening air. Jessica's heart leapt into her throat, but she quickly composed herself, putting on the same smile she had worn 1,000 times before. "Hey, hon," Mark said, his tired eyes scanning the room. "Hi," Jessica replied, her voice steady, though her insides churned. "How was your day?" "Busy," Mark sighed as he hung his coat by the door. "You know how it is. Long meetings, late clients. But I'm glad to be home. How are the kids?" "They're asleep," Jessica answered, the words slipping easily from her lips, as natural as breathing. "They had a great day." "Good, that's good." Mark moved toward her and kissed her cheek, lingering just a moment longer than usual, sensing that something was different, though he couldn't quite place it. The two of them stood there for a moment, the weight of the evening silence enveloping them. Jessica looked at Mark, trying to force herself to focus on him, to feel something familiar. But all she could hear was the pounding in her ears, the nagging reminder of what she had just done. She couldn't let him know. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. And so, they stood together in the dimly lit living room, the world outside continuing on as if nothing had changed. But Jessica knew better. She knew that something inside her had irrevocably shifted, and that the quiet, perfect life they had built together was hanging by the thinnest of threads. The following morning, the house seemed unusually still. The sun had barely risen, casting soft rays of light through the windows, but Jessica felt like the day had already begun far too early. Her eyes were bloodshot, her body heavy with exhaustion, and yet she moved mechanically, going through the motions of preparing breakfast. The usual hum of the household wasn't there. The chatter of children eagerly awaiting their meal, the sounds of toys being knocked over, or the laughter that had filled the home just hours before. Instead, the silence was oppressive, the kind that clung to the air like a thick fog. Jessica moved about the kitchen preparing scrambled eggs, her hands working in autopilot. She couldn't remember the last time she had cooked breakfast for Mark, let alone for Jake and Sophie. In fact, the whole routine felt foreign to her now, as if it belonged to someone else. The house, which once felt like a warm sanctuary filled with love and noise, now felt like a hollow shell. Every sound seemed amplified in her ears, the clink of the spoon against the bowl, the sizzle of the eggs in the pan. It all felt wrong, out of place, as if the world was spinning on while she stood frozen in time. She glanced up at the clock, her stomach twisting. Mark would be home soon. She knew that he would come in, expecting a normal morning, and for a moment she considered what it would be like to tell him everything, to let the truth spill from her lips. But she quickly pushed the thought away. She couldn't. She had to keep up the charade. There was no turning back now. The children's room was quiet, too quiet. Jessica's feet moved toward the door before she had time to consciously decide to go in. She pushed it open slowly, her heart pounding in her chest as she stepped into the room. They were still there, tucked in their beds, looking so peaceful, so innocent. It was impossible to believe that just hours before, their lives had been snuffed out like a candle's flame. The sight of them made her stomach churn, but it also made something else rise within her, a strange mix of numbness and panic. She had done it. There was no going back. Jessica stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure of what to do. Her mind raced, her thoughts swirling as she tried to piece together what had just happened. How could everything feel so normal and so utterly wrong at the same time? The children lay there, their tiny forms swallowed by the blankets, their faces angelic in their sleep. She thought about Mark walking in and finding them like this, finding them dead in their beds. The very idea made her sick, but it also made her wonder if she could even pretend anymore. Could she keep up the lie? As if on cue, she heard the familiar sound of Mark's car pulling into the driveway. The rumble of the engine seemed louder than it should have been, too intrusive for the fragile calm that had settled over the house. Panic flared in Jessica's chest. She quickly backed out of the room, closing the door behind her. She needed to act normal. She had to. Mark entered the house a few minutes later, his tired face breaking into a small smile as he took off his jacket and hung it by the door. "Morning, babe," he said, his voice low and groggy from the long night. "You didn't sleep much, did you?" Jessica forced a smile, but it felt like a mask. "I'm fine. she replied, her voice almost robotic. Just a little tired. Mark didn't seem to notice anything unusual. He moved into the kitchen, where the scent of breakfast was just beginning to fill the air. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, rubbing his eyes. He looked exhausted, as always, but there was something about the way he sat there, almost too relaxed, that made Jessica feel even more detached from the reality of what she had done. He looked so ordinary, so unsuspecting. It made her heart. "Uck, you're up early," he commented as she set the plate of eggs in front of him. "I figured you'd sleep in." "I didn't feel like sleeping," she replied, her voice thin and distant. She handed him a fork, watching as he took a bite, unaware of the dark secret hanging between them. "Kids still asleep?" Mark asked, not looking up from his breakfast. "Yeah," Jessica said, her breath catching in her throat. "They're still sleeping." There was a brief silence. Mark continued to eat, lost in the simple act of consuming his meal, while Jessica stood there, frozen, as her mind screamed for her to say something, anything to stop the overwhelming pressure inside her. But she couldn't. She couldn't say a word. Instead, she simply nodded and turned away, her thoughts racing. How long would she be able to keep this up? How long could she pretend that everything was fine when nothing ever could be again? She moved toward the window, gazing out at the quiet neighborhood, the world outside continuing as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed, and Jessica knew that the nightmare she had started the night before was only just beginning. Dew. Hours that followed were a blur of numb routine. Jessica moved through the house with the kind of mechanical precision that only the truly broken can muster. The weight of what she had done pressed heavily on her chest, but she forced herself to ignore it. Every step she took, every gesture she made, was an effort to pretend that nothing had changed, that nothing was wrong. The silence in the house was almost suffocating, and yet somehow it was easier to endure than facing the truth of what had happened. Mark, as usual, went about his day as if everything were normal. He had no idea, not even a hint of the horror that had unfolded while he was away. He kissed her goodbye, as he always did, and went to work. Jessica, left behind, stood still in the doorway for a moment, listening to the sound of his car pulling away. Once the noise of the engine faded, she exhaled a shaky breath, her body finally reacting to the fear and anxiety that had been building up inside her since the night before. The house felt unnervingly empty. There was no sound of little feet padding around the house, no laughter, no voices calling for her. She couldn't bear to go back upstairs, couldn't bring herself to look at the children again. She knew they were still there, lying in their beds, as still and lifeless as the moment she had left them. She couldn't bring herself to touch them, to kiss them good night one last time. The thought of it made her stomach turn. Instead, she cleaned. She cleaned every surface, every corner of the house, as though the physical act of scrubbing away the dirt could somehow erase what had happened. She threw out the clothes she had worn the night before, as if they might carry the lingering trace of the atrocity she had committed. She wiped down the bathroom, scrubbing away the remnants of the water, the faint traces of the life she had taken from her children. She told herself that if she just kept busy, if she just kept moving, maybe she could forget, even if just for a moment. But no matter how much she tried to distract herself, the reality of what she had done kept creeping in. It was like a shadow, always lurking just behind her, reminding her that she could never outrun it. Her thoughts swirled in a haze, and for a brief moment she thought she might go mad. What had happened to the woman she used to be? The mother, the wife, the woman who loved her children more than anything in the world. How had she become this? It wasn't until the phone rang that Jessica snapped back to reality. The sound of it was jarring, and for a moment, she just stared at the phone, unwilling to pick it up. But when the call persisted, she finally answered, her voice steady, though inside she was trembling. "Hello?" she said, her throat tight. It was Mark. "Hey, babe," he said, his voice casual. "I just wanted to check in. How's everything going? How are the kids?" For a moment, Jessica couldn't respond. The words caught in her throat, and she felt like she was suffocating. How could she answer him? How could she look him in the eye when she knew what she had done? How could she tell him the truth, knowing there was no coming back from it? But somehow she found the strength to speak. "They're fine," she said, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. "They're just still sleeping." "Good," Mark replied, unaware of the lie that hung in the air between them. "I'll be home in a few hours. I'm looking forward to seeing you." "I'm looking forward to it too," Jessica said, her voice hollow. She hung up the phone and stared at it for a long time, her mind racing. The walls of the house seemed to be closing in on her, and she knew that it was only a matter of time before the truth would come crashing down. The sound of Mark's car pulling into the driveway brought her back to the present. Her stomach tightened, and for a brief moment she thought she might lose control. But she didn't. She couldn't. She had to keep it together. She had to keep the lie intact, no matter what. Mark came in through the front door, looking tired, but smiling as he walked toward her. He kissed her on the cheek, a simple gesture, but to Jessica it felt like a dagger to her heart. She smiled back, her face frozen in an expression she didn't recognize. "Hey," Mark said, his voice warm. "How's my girl?" "I'm fine," Jessica replied, her words automatic, just a little tired. He nodded, clearly unaware that the woman he was speaking to was not the same woman who had sent him off to work that morning. He went to, the kitchen to grab a snack, still unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded in the silence of their home. Jessica watched him for a moment, feeling a deep ache in her chest, the weight of the truth pressing on her more heavily than ever before. The phone call, the quiet conversations, the small smiles, they were all part of the charade she had built. But she knew it wouldn't last forever. The truth was coming, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. And so, Jessica Miller stood there, a woman trapped by her own lies, her own darkness, knowing that there was no escape from the nightmare she had created. The quiet house around her seemed to mock her, its stillness louder than any noise could ever be. She was drowning, but there was no one to save her.